Good afternoon, everybody. This is the second week of the summer series we're doing called Life is Messy. We're following Matthew Kelly, the popular Catholic author, his latest book. He wrote this book about a year ago, also called Life is Messy. By the way, if you're a visitor or if you didn't get a copy of the book, we have some extra copies. Please take one and you can follow along for summer reading. So during the course of this 6 weeks, I'm looking at little vignettes from this book in order to gain some wisdom and insight from the fact, the undeniable fact, that life is messy. We can't avoid that fact. But we said last week that even though we are messy, our lives are filled with messiness and brokenness, we can find healing, we can find beauty, we can find even something better in the midst of the mess. And to kick off last week, Matthew Kelly talked about how so often we experience a kind of dark night in our life, periods of our life, seasons of our life where we're empty. And we try to fill up that emptiness with so many different things. We said, last week we said, if you seek to fill that emptiness with the stillness of God, to listen to God instead, you can find clarity, you can find greater intentionality and purpose in your life. Well, today, I'm going to take a few vignettes of the book from page 38 onward. If you're following along, I encourage you to do so, where Matthew talks about something that really seemed to hurt him. And remember last week I said that this book itself is kind of messy because he is sharing his private journals, a collection of his private journals, and something really, really bad that happened to him. We don't know exactly what that is because he never says. But apparently he was the victim of some really bad gossip. Have you ever experienced gossip and being on the receiving end of it? I have, and it's painful. It's hurtful. It destroys our reputation. It's destructive. And it's just one simple way in which we all experience what Matthew Kelly calls this: dehumanization. Dehumanization, that's a big word. But what he's really talking about is any way in which one human being seeks to distance himself or herself from another human being, denying that other person's worth, denying that other person's value, denying that other person's individuality. And we can do this all the time when we label other people or we put people in a category, distancing ourselves from them. And there's some things that are dehumanizing just by their very nature, just objectively. Things like violence, things like brutality, bigotry, racism, slavery. These kind of things objectively are evil because they dehumanize another person. But then there are other things that are not necessarily bad things, but they can be used in such a way to dehumanize other people, especially today in our day and age. Things like work, things like technology, things like social media, things like the gift of our sexuality. All these things are not inherently bad, but they can be used in a dehumanizing way. And one way that Matthew challenges us to look at this, how we all experience this and are kind of desensitized to it in the world, is to ask yourself this question. He asks this: what stories are currently influencing your life? Who are the storytellers you listen to? Well, think about that. 2 weeks ago, many of you know I came down with a case of COVID and I was quarantined for 5 days, and I was watching Netflix and doing a lot of watching entertaining things, which are not necessarily bad things. But, I love sci-fi. I love fantasy. I love entering into stories and novels and movies and TV. And maybe for yourself, it's TV, it's the news, perhaps it's sports. These things are not necessarily bad. They can distract us and entertain us. But the stories we listen to can also kind of distance ourselves from the real life stories of the people right in front of us, the stories of people that we don't listen to. And that's ultimately one of the dehumanizing things in our world. We just simply don't listen to one another. We ignore other people's suffering. So this is something maybe enhanced by our modern culture. I think pretty much everyone would agree with that. But it's also something not new, because human nature hasn't changed since, the fall of Adam and Eve. We're still the same human beings with the same tendency. Oh, in today's gospel, Jesus illustrates the root of it, at least in one major aspect, the root of how we experience this, what we're calling dehumanization. So just a little, and we'll look at that. We'll also look at what Jesus would propose, the Son of God, as a solution that we can fight against this dehumanization in our world. So Jesus, as you've been following along in Luke's gospel the past several weeks, we've been hearing Jesus' travel narrative as he's going to his destiny in Jerusalem. He's going to his destiny, and along the way, in these chapters in Luke's gospel, he's teaching you and me what it means to be a lifelong follower, a lifelong disciple of him. So today, the situation is that two brothers come up to him and they ask him a question. They ask him, can you resolve our conflict with our inheritance? Apparently, these two brothers are fighting over their inheritance. Jesus refuses to get in the middle of it. He denies their request. He says, I'm not your judge and arbitrator. And that's a good lesson for us, because sometimes God is not going to solve our problems for us. But instead, Jesus teaches us something from the heart, a basic principle that is about our nature, because he understands us better than any other human being who ever lived. So Luke tells us, Jesus says this, take care to guard against all greed. For though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possession. Well, Jesus recognizes that our stuff, our material things, what he calls our mammon in another place in the gospel, the number one thing that can compete in our hearts for God and enthroning him as our king in our lives. So Jesus is teaching the crowd this, and then, as he often does, he goes deeper by giving the crowd a parable. The parable goes like this. Jesus says, there was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, what shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest. And he said, this is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods. And I shall say to myself, now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry. Oh, it's interesting here, a couple of things. First of all, we don't know anything about this rich man in the parable. We don't know anything about his family. We don't know anything about his friends. We just know about him and his bountiful harvest and his big barns. He's building up bigger barns. And the second thing is interesting here, and this is fairly unique. Jesus is giving this parable, and we hear a lot of the man's inner dialogue, his inner thinking, his inner talking to himself. And it basically points to the fact that this man's heart is with his stuff. His heart, his entire livelihood, his well-being, his soul is tied up in building this bigger barn for himself. Well, then God intervenes in the parable. We hear this. But God said to him, you fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus it will be for all who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God. So God enters the story. He says, tonight, I'm sorry to tell you, you're going to die. And then he tells the man, where is your heart? What have you been investing in? Can you take that barn with you? Absolutely not. What is truly rich and what matters to God? And that's the challenge for you and for me. So you might protest. You might say, well, I have a savings account, but I'm saving it for my family. Or you might say, I have a second home, I have a family home, but it's really a family home. Or you might say, I'm generous to the poor. Yeah, God has been good to me, but I'm very generous. This is something for all of us to examine ourselves. Because again, there's nothing in this world that we can take with us to heaven except our character. That's the only thing we can take with us. And each and every day, as followers of Jesus, he's challenging us to be formed in free will, to make choices to be built up in the path of God, to be built up in God's love, to be formed in our heart, in our mind, in our soul, in deeper faith, in deeper hope, and deeper charity. We have the free choice to do so. And again, this is nothing new. In the fall of Adam and Eve, 2,000 years ago, human nature was no different than it is today. There's just different barns we build today than 2,000 years ago. Well, the challenge, my friends, the challenge is to make these choices day by day by day. Because when we're doing so, we're rehumanizing the world. We're pushing against that tendency to be isolated and dehumanized. And so that's exactly what Matthew Kelly talks about. He talks about the Great Rehumanization in very beautiful words in the book. What does that mean? It really means just counteracting every tendency that we have to be dehumanized and to dehumanize others. I think the biggest part of this is listening and hearing other people. That's one of the biggest things that I find myself doing in ministry, whether it's in the confessional or whether it's at the hospital bed or whether it's just calling someone on the phone, to listening. Because when we do so, we develop a sense of empathy for others and we acknowledge another person's humanity. But any act of kindness is rehumanizing the world. Even the smallest act of kindness that no one else sees. Any act of generosity to the poor, any act of giving of our time, giving of ourself is establishing, we're saying into the world that this is what it means to be human. Jesus came to teach us how to be human. I mean, among everything else that he has won for us by the blood of the cross, he has taught us more than any other person ever how to be human. And as I said, any act of love of God or neighbor is choosing to do so. So Matthew Kelly challenges us, and this is something you can bring to prayer for this week in this context of being rehumanized. He asks us all, how can you tip the balance toward hope and away from despair in other people's hearts? Are you an ambassador of hope? If not, what is holding you back? Oh, if we are bringing rehumanization into the world, we are being ambassadors of hope. And as I said, it can be as simple as calling another person, visiting another person, helping another person, showing kindness, having an open ear, a listening ear to another, giving of yourself. And just in that context, I want to say thank you to the parishioners of St. John, because in the past few months we have taken up a couple collections for some of our organizations in the community we call our partners in mission. For the Pregnancy Resource Center, a month or so ago, we had what we call the baby bottle boomerang. We collected more than we ever had before. We collected almost $4,000 to help single mothers. So thank you so much. And then this past month in July, for homeless veterans, for the Valor organization, we have a whole room full of stuff for them in our back classroom. So again, thank you to the parishioners. Those are acts of rehumanization in our world. So bring this to prayer, and if there's something holding you back from being an ambassador of hope, bring that to God too. What's holding you back? What wound, what hurt? Because even if that is a great hurt, you can still turn your gaze toward loving your neighbor. You can still bring rehumanization. And in that act of kindness or listening or generosity, you will find healing yourself. Well, bottom line in this whole 6 weeks and the message of Matthew Kelly's book is that life is messy. Life is always going to be messy, but life can be, and indeed is also beautiful. Amen.